in summary, the first act we're going to deal with, the Design and Building Practitioners Act, was assented to on the 11th of June, as we've said. It does set out a system of registration and provision of declarations for design and building practitioners. Those registration and compliance declarations, however, will not take place or not be applicable until next year. In other words, till the 1st of July 2021. The key piece in the legislation, however, which provides for a duty of care for by developers owed to landowners, will, however, take place on the commencement of the Act. It's just that the issues of registration and compliance declarations, however, won't take place until July next year. As you can see from the slide, a standard of care for the duty of care is set out in terms of trying to explain to landowners what the standard of duty of care will be, and which is owed by building practitioners, building designers, and engineers involved in these particular projects. The Design and Building Practitioners Act applies only to multi-unit and multi-storey residential apartment buildings. The regulations, which have not yet been drafted, may provide for the applicability of this legislation to other style developments. But at the moment, it only applies to multi-storey, multi-unit developments, Class 2 buildings where you have 2 or more occupiers in place. It doesn't apply to existing work or arrangements, only applies to new work or arrangements entered into after the commencement of the proposed legislation. Let's look at the key players. The key players are important to understand who is involved in and caught up in this new legislation. We have the building practitioner on the right side. Principally, they will be the person responsible for carrying out the building work. Building work has been expanded or has been to include design, but from the building practitioner's perspective, they are responsible for building the work, for carrying out construction of the building elements. Building element has been taken from the definition set out in the Home Building Act in relation to building work, including building elements, waterproofing, fire safety, and it really affects the major structural element of a building. The building practitioners owe a duty of care to take all reasonable steps to ensure that the building work they do complies with the relevant BCA. They do have defence, which we'll set out a little bit later. They are also required to have adequate insurance. The next key principal player is a principal design practitioner. So as we said earlier, this legislation seeks to broaden the scope of the umbrella by which you have a responsibility owed not only for building work, but building design. These building design practitioners, for example, architects, are responsible for, building principal design are to coordinate the provision of design compliance declarations. By that I mean, they have to ensure that a design practitioner that prepares a regulated design issues a compliance declaration for each building element as part of the building. So we have the compliance declaration issued by the design practitioner. The design practitioner is also required to be appropriately registered for the type of work for which they issue a compliance declaration. So it's then the responsibility of that design practitioner, again, to have appropriate insurance that matches the work that they are doing. The third major player in this is the principal design practitioner. So their role is to coordinate the provision of a design compliance declaration. So they have to ensure that the compliance declaration for each building element is being provided by a registered design practitioner and they also have to ensure that that design practitioner's registration is appropriate for that declaration for which they are making under the legislation. Those principal design practitioners will also have to have appropriate insurance. The legislation talks about if a principal design practitioner is engaged. I would think that unless you have a larger project, I would suggest that the building practitioner would work with the design practitioner, who's more likely going to be, for example, an architect. For example, if you have a larger project, however, you may have the involvement of a principal design practitioner who's overseeing the registered designs, making sure that each of those has a proper and appropriate design declaration. The Act also makes provision for two other key parties: a professional engineer. So in the original bill, which was flagged in October last year, it sort of hinted that professional engineers might be caught up, but now this legislation, which has been amended after discussion and taking various soundings from stakeholders, includes specific reference to a professional engineer. The Act makes clear that that person is responsible for the design, the production, operation and engineering work, which involves a specialist engineering scope. That sort of person will be caught up or regarded as a person that's a professional engineer caught up in this legislation. Again, they will need to be registered. They will also need to be insured. In other words, have appropriate insurance. The fifth category of person which will be caught up in this legislation is the specialist practitioner. The Act does not make clear what specialist work is, but could I suggest to you that by reference to the New South Wales Office of Fair Trading, it issues, as you know, licences for various contractors and various levels. So it issues a contractor licence for people that are responsible for carrying out building work, a building practitioner. A specialist practitioner may include a person that is responsible for building and design work concerning electrical, air conditioning, plumbing and other work that they may be regarded as a specialist practitioner. They will also need to be appropriately registered and hold appropriate insurance. So they are the key players. What are the key elements involved in this legislation? The first one we'll look at relates to design practitioners. Now, I think we've covered some of this in the earlier point in our slides. The key things are that they are to be registered, that they are to issue a design compliance declaration. In other words, for every design that is prepared, they will issue a compliance declaration that the design will meet or satisfies the various Australian standards and or the Building Code of Australia, or it might be for the National Construction Code, where you have a performance solution which has been prepared. So we have a design practitioner who's registered. They'll issue a compliance declaration that each of those designs will meet the relevant Australian standards. The design declaration will also capture their providing a declaration covering variations. So this is quite common in building, where you have an agreement between the parties that there be work which differs from the original agreed contract. Variations leads to a lot of issues and disputes. Variations will also be required to hold or to be covered by a compliance design declaration prepared by the relevant designer. The important thing is that they also must be indemnified. In other words, appropriate insurance needs to be in place, and that this has got to be appropriate for the type of work for which is being done. There's also a provision in the legislation whereby if a company is carrying out or preparing the design and preparing a design compliance declaration, the directors, might also be individually liable for a failure to comply with the legislation. legislation. So again, what this piece of legislation does is it seeks to go beyond or behind the corporate veil and make directors of those relevant parties that are carrying out design work as a corporate entity personally liable for a failure to comply with the legislation. So that's the design practitioners. The legislation also makes provision for the role and a comparison between the responsibilities of the design practitioner as opposed to the building practitioner. There are differing standards of care which are owed by these parties. Briefly, we'll look at these. The important thing for designers is that they prepare a regulated design. It's defined in the Act to include cover building work, so it will cover work involving building elements, will cover major structural work, and will also compose or rely on or capture performance solutions for prescribed classes of work. So we have a regulated design which is going to cover building work. We have registered building practitioners. They again will have to complete a declaration that they have carried out their work in accordance with reasonable care. So the building practitioners will have to take all reasonable steps to ensure. They also have defence under sections 25 and 26 of the Act that their work has been carried out reasonably reliant on the designs and plans that they have received. Quite similar to the current Home Building Act, which says that a builder may have a defence in relation to building work where there is a claim for building defect in relation to where he's able to say or establish that he's reasonably followed the designs that have been prepared for him. I'd suggest to you, however, that for the designers, there is a higher standard. The designers are required in mandatory terms to comply, that they must comply except with reasonable excuse. So it seems to me the legislation imposes an increased or a higher standard of care for parties that are responsible for preparing and or coordinating design and or design declarations. I'd suggest to you that this is a major change to the legislation, which principally has sought to capture the responsibility of both design practitioners and building practitioners. We spoke earlier about the duty of care, but the Act goes into some detail in Part 4 as to what is meant by the duty of care. It's not going to cover all work. What it will do is it's designed to capture work for building defects. So firstly, it's meant to provide coverage for owners of the land. It'll be the owner of the land. The Act also makes provision for this to include an owners corporation, an association for a community or a precinct or a neighbourhood. So they are owed the duty of care. The person that owes it is the person that is carrying out the construction work. By construction work, the Act specifically expands that not only to include construction work, but also design work. So this is where the duty of care owed to owners and will capture both the design and the construction work. The legislation also makes clear that the actual duty is to avoid economic loss concerning building defects. There's no cap on the damages that may be awarded for economic loss. That's a major boon in the legislation from a consumer perspective. So, for example, in the Home Building Act, there's a provision for the damages to be recovered for defective and or incomplete building work. Similarly, with the Design and Building Practitioners Act, there's a provision for damages for economic loss for rectification. This piece of legislation makes clear that there's no cap on the damages which may be awarded, which is significant. In other words, defective work and design work which results in economic loss, that will entitle the relevant owner to make a claim. When we talk about a duty of care, though, then the first thing is that you cannot delegate. So from a construction contract setting, the builder cannot delegate down the line to his subcontractors responsibility on their part to take responsibility for work that he is responsible for. The Act says no to that. It says no to parties delegating their rights, in other words saying we're going to agree to contract out of our rights, so the most powerful person in the contract setting will be able to pass their responsibility to other parties. This legislation says that cannot be done. What the Act also makes clear is that these rights of a duty of care for economic loss are in addition to the other statutory rights and duties set out in other key pieces of legislation, specifically the statutory warranties set out in the Home Building Act in section 18B, which make provision for 6 sets of statutory warranties in relation to the work and the building product, that they will be new, they will be fit for purpose, and they will be in compliance with the relevant standards and codes.